Welcome to Revenge Gate. Let's dive into today's story coming from New York City. The merciless summer heat bore down on Manhattan's concrete jungle, turning every step into a battle against suffocation as I wrestled with a heavy wheelchair through impossible terrain. My name is Claire, a 30-year old-fashioned designer from Brooklyn who spent most of her adult life putting everyone else first, while her own ambitions gathered dust on a shelf. This morning carried more weight than any other day of my existence because I was racing toward a high-stakes legal appointment that would either secure my future or destroy it completely. But when I spotted an elderly gentleman named Walter trapped in his wheelchair, surrounded by construction chaos and dangerous open pits in the sidewalk, something inside me refused to keep walking. Even though every second mattered and a crucial inheritance battle waited for me across town, my heart wouldn't allow me to abandon someone so vulnerable in such a hazardous place. Walter gazed up at me with astonishment in his tired eyes, his voice wavering as he questioned why someone dressed for an important meeting would risk destroying her outfit just to help a complete stranger. I told him honestly that while this appointment could change everything, basic human decency mattered more than any amount of money, and a knowing smile slowly spread across his weathered features. "Wait, are you also going to the inheritance meeting at Sterling Legal Group?" I asked in complete shock after he mentioned our shared destination. What an incredible coincidence. Come on then, let's go together, because I'm not letting you face those heartless people by yourself. Standing together before the imposing glass tower of the law office, an unexpected wave of calm washed over me, anchored somehow by the quiet strength radiating from this seemingly fragile old man. Before we get into how this random encounter completely destroyed my sister's carefully laid plans, please show some love to our channel by hitting that like button and subscribing right now. I also want to connect with you personally, so drop your name and city in the comments while typing the word present, because I genuinely love knowing where my amazing audience is tuning in from. Just 2 days after we laid our father to rest, the peaceful mourning period in our childhood home was shattered by pure, undisguised greed. My sister Victoria hadn't shed a single tear throughout the entire funeral, but instead devoted every waking moment to frantically searching through drawers and closets, hunting for documentation of our family's most valuable possessions. While I remained buried under waves of grief from losing my last living parent, Victoria was already mentally calculating the market value of grandmother's antique jewelry collection and the prime Manhattan penthouse. She cornered me in the kitchen one afternoon, slamming a thick stack of suspicious-looking invoices onto the marble counter with ice gold calculation burning in her eyes. "Claire, you need to sign these papers immediately because the funeral expenses and our parents' outstanding medical bills have completely drained the estate's available cash," Victoria announced in a tone completely devoid of warmth or compassion. I stared at those documents in disbelief, realizing she was attempting to manipulate me into surrendering my legal claim to the only home I'd ever known. A fierce argument erupted when Victoria launched into attacking me for wasting 6 precious years of my life struggling as an independent designer instead of earning what she called a real salary like she did at her investment firm. She circled the living room while insisting that my creative work was worthless compared to the supposed financial contributions she'd made to the family over the years. I held my ground and reminded her that I was the one who actually changed Mom's wound dressings and stayed awake through endless nights providing care during those final excruciating months of her battle with illness. While I sacrificed my youth and career trajectory to give our parents comfort in their darkest hours, Victoria had barely managed to send an occasional text message or spare 5 minutes for a phone call to check on their condition. You were nothing but a glorified housekeeper who lived here rent-free while I was out in the real world building something meaningful for this family. Victoria spat at me with venom that made my blood turn to ice. The situation spiraled out of control when Victoria grabbed my vintage dress form and started shoving my meager belongings into beat-up suitcases with frenzied, hateful energy. She dragged my possessions toward the front entrance while screaming that I no longer had any right to occupy even 1 square foot of this valuable Manhattan real estate, now that our parents were dead. In a display of absolute cruelty, Victoria hurled my luggage into the dimly lit apartment building hallway just as torrential summer rain began hammering against the windows. Consider yourself officially removed from this family, Claire, because I refuse to let a struggling artist damage the reputation of my new residence. She yelled before slamming the heavy door directly in my face. I stood alone in that corridor while the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot through the empty silence. Trembling with rage and heartbreak, I struggled to drag my rain-soaked suitcases toward the elevator while my mind raced trying to figure out where I'd sleep that night. Just as I reached the building's entrance, my phone vibrated with a call from an unknown number that turned out to be Victoria's aggressive attorney, Harrison. His voice carried professional polish but absolutely zero human warmth as he informed me that tomorrow morning's inheritance meeting would be the final step in making my homelessness both permanent and legally enforceable. Harrison warned me that any attempt to challenge the fraudulent debts would trigger a defamation lawsuit that would guarantee I'd never find work in this city again. That's when I understood that my own sister had been orchestrating this ambush for months, simply waiting for the exact moment our parents passed away to execute her final strike. The crushing weight of her betrayal felt heavier than the waterlogged suitcases I was hauling through the downpour toward the nearest subway entrance. I knew that tomorrow's meeting had evolved beyond a simple dispute about money into a battle for my survival and dignity against my own flesh and blood. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, my alarm clock's sharp blare cut through the cramped space of my small design studio in Brooklyn, where I'd been forced to sleep on a makeshift bed constructed from fabric bolts and sample materials. My spine ached from the uneven surface beneath me, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest as I prepared for what lay ahead. I spent the first hour meticulously steaming my only formal navy dress, desperately hoping this small act of grooming would preserve my last shred of dignity before confronting the wealthy and arrogant Victoria. As steam rose from the fabric, I realized that maintaining a professional appearance was my sole defense against the inevitable insults my sister would throw at my modest financial status. Just as I finished getting ready, my closest friend Rebecca showed up at the studio carrying 2 cups of hot coffee and a bag of fresh bagels to fortify me for the ordeal ahead. "Claire, you've spent your entire life being the heart of this family, so please don't let that woman bully you into surrendering what you rightfully deserve," Rebecca said while handing me the coffee with a reassuring squeeze of my hand. Her presence provided a desperately needed buffer against the cold reality of my situation, because I felt utterly isolated after being cast out of my childhood home. We sat surrounded by rolls of silk and cotton, while she listened to my fears about the falsified documents that Victoria and Harrison had likely prepared to strip me of my inheritance. Just as I felt a moment of peace, my phone buzzed on the cutting table with a notification that made my heart plummet. Victoria had sent a vicious text message stating that if I dared show up at the prestigious Manhattan law firm looking like a pathetic unemployed failure, she would ensure I was humiliated in front of every attorney in the building. Remember your place as a struggling designer, and don't embarrass my social standing with your presence today." The message read with cruelty that felt like a physical punch to my gut. Rebecca glanced at the screen and shook her head in disgust, while reminding me that Victoria's wealth could never purchase the kind of integrity I possessed. I quickly gathered my legal papers into a worn leather portfolio and rushed toward the subway station. But my luck took another terrible turn when I discovered the entire train line was shut down due to a major power outage. With time evaporating and the oppressive heat of the New York summer already building, I had no choice but to start running toward the bus terminal more than 10 blocks away. Sweat began destroying my carefully steamed dress, while the humid air made my hair frizz and stick to my neck, creating exactly the disheveled appearance Victoria had mocked. My feet throbbed in my modest heels as I dodged frantic commuters and confused tourists on the crowded city sidewalks. As I rounded a corner near a noisy construction zone, I suddenly spotted an elderly man in a worn wheelchair struggling beside a deep crack in the broken pavement. This stranger looked utterly helpless as he desperately tried maneuvering his heavy wheels out of a dangerous gap, while countless people rushed past him without offering even a glance of assistance. His face was flushed with effort, and he appeared remarkably fragile against the backdrop of massive steel beams and deafening jackhammers surrounding the dusty street. I didn't know anything about him, but the sight of his trembling hands reminded me so powerfully of Dad in his final days that I instinctively dropped my portfolio and rushed toward him. "Please stay still for just a moment, sir, and let me help you before you accidentally tip over into that open construction pit," I called out while rushing to grab the handles of his wheelchair. The old man looked up at me with eyes clouded by exhaustion and profound relief as I used all my strength to lift the front wheels out of the sidewalk trap. "You're clearly in a desperate hurry, young lady, so why are you stopping to help a stranger who has nothing to offer you in return?" The man, who later introduced himself as Walter, asked with a raspy voice that sounded surprisingly steady despite his physical predicament. I wiped sweat from my forehead and told him that my father had taught me helping those in need was far more important than any appointment, even one as critical as the legal battle awaiting me. 15 minutes later, I summoned every ounce of remaining physical strength to lift both Walter and his heavy metal wheelchair up the steep steps of the last city bus, heading toward the legal district. The interior was stifling and packed with mourning commuters, who seemed completely indifferent to an elderly man's struggle to find a stable place to rest. I navigated through the sea of frustrated faces to secure the most accessible spot for Walter, while I stood firmly beside him, gripping the overhead handrail with shoulders that throbbed from sheer exhaustion. Every time the bus lurched forward or braked suddenly in heavy Manhattan traffic, I used my body as a human barrier to prevent his wheelchair from sliding across the grimy floor. Walter looked up at me with soft gratitude in his weary eyes as he realized I was prioritizing his safety over my own comfort. The air was thick with the scent of rain, dampened clothing, and old exhaust fumes, but the quiet dignity emanating from my new companion made the unpleasant environment feel surprisingly bearable. He began speaking in a low, resonant voice that somehow managed to cut through the loud rumble of the diesel engine and the chatter of other passengers. Walter started sharing detailed stories about the many years he'd spent serving a prominent family that sounded remarkably similar to my own history with my parents and the home I'd just lost. He spoke with such intimate knowledge about the varying temperaments of children within wealthy households, describing how some were born with hearts of gold, while others allowed greed to corrupt their souls from the inside out. I didn't recognize his true identity at all, but I felt a profound emotional connection as he mentioned beautiful, warm memories of a man who reminded me exactly of my father in his prime. Your father sounds like he was a man of exceptional character who believed a person's worth was measured by their kindness rather than their bank balance, Walter remarked while observing my tearful reaction to his nostalgic descriptions. I found it incredibly strange that this stranger could articulate the exact values my parents had instilled in me before Victoria decided to erase their legacy with her corporate ruthlessness. His words acted as soothing balm for my wounded spirit because they reminded me I wasn't alone in cherishing the humble life I'd built as a designer. Walter noticed the persistent cloud of anxiety in my eyes and reached out to pat my hand with a firm, reassuring touch that felt like the protection of a guardian. Don't let the darkness of others extinguish your light, Claire, because people with benevolent hearts always deserve and receive protection from unseen forces in their darkest hours. He stated with conviction that made me wonder if he knew more about my predicament than he was revealing. I took a deep breath and finally admitted to Walter that I was absolutely terrified of Victoria's sharp, predatory intellect and her cunning lawyer Harrison. I explained that I lacked the financial resources to hire professional legal defense to contest the mountain of fraudulent documents they'd undoubtedly prepared to render me homeless. Harrison is known for being ruthless and thrives on intimidation, and Victoria has always been the favored daughter who gets exactly what she wants through sheer force of will. I whispered while clutching my worn leather portfolio to my chest. Walter listened with terrifyingly calm focus, his grip on his cane tightening slightly as I described the systematic way my sister had dismantled our family bonds for a piece of real estate. Justice is a living thing that often hides in the most unexpected places, so you must keep your head high when you walk into that office today, Walter replied while looking directly into my eyes with a gaze that felt as sharp as a judge's gavel. With only 15 minutes remaining before the meeting was scheduled to begin, Walter and I entered the gleaming glass lobby of the towering skyscraper located in the heart of luxurious Manhattan. The polished marble floors reflected bright overhead lights, while the sheer scale of the architecture seemed designed to make ordinary people feel insignificant and small. I immediately noticed Walter looked somewhat dehydrated from our journey through the heat, so I used some of my last remaining cash to purchase a cold bottle of water from a nearby vendor. I knelt beside his wheelchair and used my only clean silk scarf to carefully wipe away streaks of dried mud that had splattered onto his worn cotton sleeves during our struggle near the construction site. It was important to me that he felt respected, even in this intimidating environment where luxury and power seemed to be the only currencies that mattered to anyone. Walter watched my movements with quiet, observant intensity, while a small smile of appreciation flickered across his weathered face as he took a refreshing sip of water. The serene moment shattered with the rhythmic, aggressive clicking of high heels against the hard stone floor as Victoria appeared from the elevator bank, dressed in an expensive designer suit that screamed Wall Street success. She moved with practiced arrogance that forced other people to step out of her path, while a cloud of cloying perfume announced her presence long before she actually reached us. When Victoria's eyes finally landed on me standing next to a man in a battered wheelchair, she let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed uncomfortably throughout the high-ceilinged lobby. "Claire, I explicitly warned you not to embarrass me today, but here you are standing next to some disheveled old vagrant as if you're trying to win an award for the most pathetic person in New York." Victoria sneered while her eyes traveled over my sweat-stained dress with visible disgust. She looked at Walter as if he were a stain on the pristine marble, while her body language radiated superiority that made my stomach churn with anger and deep-seated shame. Standing right beside Victoria was Harrison, who kept checking his gold watch with an expression of profound impatience and annoyance at being forced to share public space with people he clearly considered inferior. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down his nose at my worn leather portfolio, making it obvious he viewed this entire inheritance meeting as mere formality before crushing my remaining hopes. Victoria stepped even closer to us, her face contorting into a mask of cruelty as she reached out and snatched the bottle of water directly out of my trembling hands. "You clearly have enough money to waste on charity for strangers, while you can't even afford decent shoes for a legal meeting of this magnitude," Victoria remarked before deliberately pouring the remaining water onto the floor, so it splashed all over my old leather pumps. I stood frozen in shock at her petty display of malice while the cold liquid soaked into my socks, making me feel even more humiliated in front of busy professionals walking past us. "My sister is right about one thing, Claire, because you really are a magnet for trash, and this broken old man is the perfect companion for a failed designer like you," Victoria continued with a voice dripping with venomous contempt. I started to speak in my own defense, but Walter suddenly reached out and placed a firm hand on my arm, his calm presence acting like an anchor in the middle of my emotional storm. A person who measures their worth by the height of their heels and the price of their suit is often standing on a very hollow foundation. Wouldn't you agree, young lady? Walter asked while looking directly at Victoria with a gaze that was remarkably steady and unafraid of her wealth. Victoria looked as though she'd been slapped by a commoner, her face turning a deep shade of crimson as she realized this vagrant actually had the audacity to talk back to her in public. "You should keep your mouth shut and be grateful I haven't called security to drag you out of this building for being a public nuisance," Victoria hissed while Harrison stepped forward to reinforce her intimidation with his towering physical presence. Walter merely tilted his head slightly and maintained his terrifyingly calm demeanor, while the tension between us became thick enough to suffocate everyone in the lobby. 9 o'clock in the morning arrived as the nearby clock tower chimed with deep resonance that echoed through the canyons of Manhattan. The tension in the lobby reached a breaking point because Victoria had completely lost her patience. She paced frantically on the marble floor while her eyes darted toward the security desk with predatory intensity that signaled she was ready to initiate a full-scale confrontation. "I will not have this prestigious building tainted by the presence of a filthy vagrant who belongs in a shelter rather than a corporate office," Victoria screamed as she signaled for uniformed security guards to approach our corner. 2 burly men in dark suits moved quickly toward us, while Victoria pointed an accusing finger at Walter, claiming he was a professional scammer who'd been harassing her for money since she arrived. I immediately stepped forward and positioned my body as a physical shield between the guards and the old man, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs with a mixture of terror and fierce protectiveness. "This man is a guest traveling with me, and you have absolutely no legal right to insult the dignity of an elderly citizen who's done nothing but sit here quietly," I declared with a voice that shook but remained loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. The security guards hesitated for a moment when they saw the unwavering conviction in my eyes, but Victoria stepped forward and began berating them for their supposed incompetence in handling a simple trespasser. "Do you realize who I am and how much business my firm brings to this establishment every single year?" Victoria balked at the head guard while her face distorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. I looked at the guard and explained that Walter was under my care and that any attempt to forcibly remove him would be met with a formal complaint for harassment and age discrimination. Victoria erupted into mocking laughter at my defense, claiming my fake saintly personality was exactly why I was destined to leave the upcoming meeting with absolutely nothing to my name. Your pathetic obsession with helping the helpless is a weakness that will ensure you end up just like this old man, sleeping on a park bench while I enjoy the fruits of our parents' hard work. Victoria sneered with cruelty that made several bystanders turn their heads in shock. While Victoria was busy orchestrating an eviction, Harrison stepped closer to me and used his thick stack of legal folders to rhythmically tap against my shoulder in a patronizing and intimidating gesture. He leaned in so close I could smell stale coffee on his breath, while he began whispering a series of terrifying threats regarding the mountain of evidence they'd supposedly gathered. Claire, your sister has meticulously documented every single one of your failures, and we have enough legal paperwork here to ensure a judge validates your disinheritance within minutes. Harrison warned with a cold, shark-like smile that made me feel like I was drowning in corporate jargon. He claimed my lack of financial contribution over the last decade would be used as primary ammunition to prove I was an unfit beneficiary who was merely parasitic in nature. I tried to pull away from his stifling presence, but Victoria blocked my path, her eyes gleaming with sick satisfaction as the security guards began moving in again under her relentless pressure. Throughout this entire chaotic spectacle, Walter remained in a state of terrifyingly calm silence that felt like the eye of a hurricane amidst surrounding madness. He didn't say a word to defend himself against accusations of being a vagrant, but his sharp, intelligent eyes never left Victoria's face as he carefully observed every twitch of greed and every expression of malice. It was as if he was recording her soul onto a permanent ledger, judging the very essence of her character, while she continued digging her own professional grave with her razor-sharp tongue. Are you quite finished with this embarrassing display of insecurity, or do you require an even larger audience for your spectacular lack of class? Walter finally asked with a voice so steady and commanding that the security guards immediately stopped in their tracks. Victoria opened her mouth to launch another volley of insults, but the sheer weight of Walter's gaze seemed to paralyze her for a split second, creating heavy silence that hung over us like a guillotine. I felt a strange shiver run down my spine because I realized the man I'd helped on the street was no longer just a fragile stranger, but a silent witness preparing to deliver a verdict none of us could have ever anticipated. 30 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the executive conference room swung open to admit us into a sterile environment that smelled of expensive leather and chilling professional coldness. The massive mahogany table in the center seemed to stretch for miles, while sunlight filtering through floor. Ealing windows offered no warmth to the frozen atmosphere. Harrison immediately took his place at the head of the table and began spreading out several documents with practiced efficiency that made my heart sink into the pit of my stomach. He pulled out a sophisticated copy of a will featuring what appeared to be an official signature from my parents declaring Victoria was the sole beneficiary of every single piece of real estate and all family savings. According to this fraudulent document, my years of sacrifice were worth absolutely nothing, and I was to be stripped of my legal rights to the penthouse and the family legacy. Victoria leaned back in her leather chair with a triumphant smirk, while she slid a separate piece of paper toward me, demanding I sign a formal waiver of all my inheritance claims. In exchange for my silence and cooperation, she offered me a pitiful sum of $5,000 as charity that felt more like a slap in the face than a gesture of kindness. Sign the paper now, Claire, and perhaps I'll allow you to keep some of your old sewing equipment before the locks are changed on the apartment for good, Victoria remarked with a voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction. Just as I reached for the pen with trembling fingers, feeling the crushing weight of total defeat, Walter suddenly raised his hand and demanded everyone in the room stop their proceedings immediately. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket and produced a gleaming high-level legal credentials badge featuring the official seal of the state's highest judicial oversight committee. The entire room fell into stunned silence as Walter opened his battered leather briefcase to reveal a pristine original copy of the true will that had been signed and sealed in total secrecy years ago. "I suggest you put that forged piece of garbage away, Harrison, because I am the sole legal custodian of the only testament that carries the true intent of the deceased," Walter announced with a voice that had transformed into a thunderous force of undeniable authority. Victoria's face turned an ashen shade of gray as she stared at the badge and the documents, while realization began dawning on her that the man she'd mocked was the one person my parents trusted more than their own flesh and blood. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, while her hands began shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to remain upright in her seat. The horror on Victoria's face intensified when Walter began reading a specific secret clause in the original will that addressed the exact behavior she'd displayed over the past several years. He explained that my father had anticipated her greed and had included a morality provision stating that any heir who engaged in fraudulent activities or mistreatment of family members would be automatically disqualified from receiving a single cent of the estate. "You were so blinded by your own perceived superiority that you forgot our parents were master observers of human character, Victoria," Walter stated while looking directly into her panicked eyes. He revealed he'd been recording every single insult she'd hurled at me in the lobby, and that her attempt to bribe me into silence with $5,000 was now documented proof of her corruption. Victoria let out a strangled cry of desperation as she realized her entire world was collapsing because of a man she'd tried to have arrested only an hour ago. "This cannot be happening because I was the successful one who was supposed to manage the family fortune, while Claire was just a miserable failure," she shrieked while her voice cracked under immense pressure of her own undoing. Harrison tried to intervene with a weak legal objection, but Walter silenced him with a single icy glance that reminded everyone in the room of his decades of experience in the highest echelons of law. The fraudulent attorney began sweating through his expensive silk shirt as he realized his professional license was now in jeopardy for participating in Victoria's elaborate scheme to rob her own sister. Walter continued reading the final instructions of my father, which named me as the primary executor and rightful owner of the Manhattan penthouse and the entirety of the family's investment funds. I looked at the old man who'd seemed so fragile on the street and realized he was a giant who'd spent his entire life protecting the integrity of the people he served. Victoria continued babbling incoherent excuses while her lawyer began packing his bags in a frantic attempt to distance himself from the disaster he'd helped create. The air in the room finally began to feel breathable again as truth settled into every corner of the office, marking the definitive end of Victoria's reign of terror over my life. I realized then that my father's final gift wasn't just the money or the property, but the presence of a man who could ensure justice was served with a level of precision that no amount of money could ever buy. 10 o'clock in the morning arrived, and the meeting concluded in haunting silence as the filthy schemes of Victoria were finally exposed to the unforgiving light of day. Based on the authentic original will and the irrefutable audio evidence of Victoria's verbal abuse in the lobby, the legal transfer of the family home and all remaining assets to my name was finalized immediately. Victoria collapsed onto the polished floor, her designer suit wrinkling as she sobbed uncontrollably while begging for forgiveness she'd never shown to anyone else. She promised to change her ways and offered to help me manage the estate, but I only looked down at her with profound disappointment that outweighed any lingering anger. The realization that she was only sorry because she'd lost her fortune made it impossible for me to feel even a shred of sympathy for her current predicament. Victoria continued wailing about the unfairness of the situation until Walter sternly reminded her that her own cruelty was the sole architect of her spectacular downfall today. The consequences extended far beyond loss of inheritance, because Walter turned his cold professional gaze toward Harrison and announced his intention to file a formal complaint with the State Bar Association. He detailed the evidence of Harrison's collusion in falsifying legal documents, which would effectively ensure the lawyer's prestigious career went up in flames before the end of the week. Harrison's face went completely pale as he realized no amount of corporate connections could save him from the wrath of a legendary legal figure like Walter. I stood up and quietly asked Victoria to leave the office, declaring that from this moment forward, we no longer shared any familial bond or legal connection. The sisterly love that should have existed between us had died long ago, buried under the weight of her insatiable greed and her contempt for the simple life I chose to lead. Victoria attempted to grab my hand one last time, but I stepped back and watched as the security guards she'd once summoned now escorted her out of the room in total disgrace. I turned to Walter and expressed my deepest gratitude for his protection, realizing that the kindness I'd shown a stranger on the street had returned to save my life in the most unexpected way. We walked out of the towering glass building together, and I noticed the Manhattan sky seemed remarkably clear and blue today, as if the atmosphere itself had been cleansed by the triumph of justice. I knew my future would be dedicated to honoring the legacy of Mom and Dad by using my new resources to help those who'd been overlooked by society. As I watched Walter disappear into his sleek black sedan, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since before my parents fell ill. The weight of the past was finally gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a woman who'd reclaimed her home and her dignity through nothing more than the power of her own integrity. This story serves as a powerful reminder that genuine kindness is never a waste of time, and those who intentionally trample on others to achieve success will always eventually face a bitter and lonely ending. Real wealth isn't found in a bank account or a prestigious title, but in the strength of one's character and the willingness to help a fellow human being during their darkest hour of need. I want to sincerely thank each and every one of you for staying until the very end of my journey. Your support means the world to me. Please take a moment to share your own thoughts or personal experiences regarding betrayal and justice in the comments section below, as I truly value your unique perspectives on this story.